the white supremacist culture, as you were talking about earlier, of I am the center of the universe and I have power and perfectionism and all of that. What we don't talk about enough is how that makes people extremely lonely, extremely disconnected, extremely heartbroken. And the connected way that we all feel is the way forward, that web of interconnection, is maybe you will have less in your 401k, but you will feel more cared for and more part of something larger, something that has hope and solidarity and community. I think as human beings, that's what we are looking for.
Have you been feeling disconnected, worried, or overwhelmed in life, or when you look at the state of our country and the world? If so, you're not alone. I'm right there with you, and you're in the right place. Hi, friends. Welcome to the Connected Way podcast. I'm your host and minister of connection, Rev Dev. I believe that connection is the healing path forward for us as individuals and as a collective. So on this podcast, we will explore all things connection to self, to others, to the land, and spirituality. But specifically in season 1, we are looking at the coming election through the lens of connection, how we can get informed and involved in politics and this election in digestible and engaging ways, how our spiritual and cultural beliefs and values intersect with and inform politics, how this election fits in with the larger evolution of our society, and how we can actually connect with people in these polarizing times. I know that connection has the capacity to move the needle in this election and in our individual and collective evolution. May it be so. Let's get into it. Welcome back, friends. Before we get into this episode, I want to mention 2 things. First, my hope is that ideally I get you 2 episodes a week, one on Wednesdays that's a little bit more political, cultural realm, and one on Sundays that has a bit more of a spiritual discussion infused into it. It is Sunday after all. We'll see how that goes, but I want you to know that that's my intention. So stay tuned. And the second note is that I want you to be able to connect with these episodes, and I want the content to be accessible and approachable to anyone and everyone. I will always do my best to use language and ask guests to clarify or explain things that I don't know or understand, or that I think you might not know or understand. I've actually decided to record this introduction after the interview, which I don't usually do, but I realized something after I did this interview, and the content is so rich. But I want to mention that there are concepts that we mention that we don't explain in detail, like terms, ideas. I've done my best to do that, but I'm including in the show notes a bunch of resources and references. And I also want to take this opportunity to ask you to please connect with me, reach out and ask me questions. You can comment on Instagram, you can DM me, you can contact me through the website. There's so many different ways to get in touch. But if there's anything that you don't understand that you want to, if there's something that you want to learn more about or you're curious about, or if you have any questions at all, please let me know. This podcast is for you and for all of us. So you are part of this co-creation, and I really welcome your input and also your questions. And so please let me know if there's anything that you don't understand or want to know more about. And thank you for being on this journey with me. All right, let's get into it. As you know, this podcast is all about connecting with people to enhance our understanding of, sense of, and experience of connection. In this episode, we are connecting with a spiritual leader about her insights, but also about her personal experiences, beliefs, and values, and what that means for her political choices. And then we also get into the larger meaning of what's going on in the world. It's a big episode, and I'm excited you're here for it. Today, I am connecting with Reverend Dr. Sushmita Mukherjee. She is my dear friend, one of my deans and teachers from seminary, and we have become close friends since then. We are talking today with her because she has really fascinating perspectives on spirituality, religion, and politics, their intersection. And as someone with a very rich and dynamic spiritual path, as well as a rich and dynamic cultural path, given that she is a first-generation American, having moved here from India in her 20s. She has so much to share. Here's a bit more about her. She is an associate professor and director of optical microscopy and image analysis at Weill Cornell Medical College in New York City, an ordained interspiritual minister, a spiritual companion, and a faculty member at One Spirit Seminary, my seminary. Her work thrives at the interface of interspirituality and an engagement of the image, whether scientific, psychological, or spiritual. You can find all of her work and learn more about her at www.on-seeing.com. Sushmita, I am so excited to be here with you. The reason that Sushmita is here because she's amazing, but also because she has a really fascinating background. She grew up in India and was based in the Hinduism religion. She now is teaching at an interfaith interspiritual seminary because her journey has evolved and changed. She's also an incredible scientist, and so she brings science into the conversation all the time and is also fascinated with non-duality. And so there is so much depth to what she can share, and I have no doubt this is the first of many conversations that I will have with Sushmita on this podcast if she will continue to join me, which I hope she will. So, Sushmita, we're going to get into some things about the election eventually, but I think it would be really helpful for our guests to first hear a little bit about you and your background and how your life and spirituality has evolved over the years.
All right. So first off, I'm very excited to be here in the beginning stages of this labor of love that I know that you've been incubating for such a long time. It feels really good to be here to support you on this. So
thank you for being here.
In terms of my arc, where I started and where I have arrived, it's been an incredible journey. You know, I live in New York City on Roosevelt Island, which is this tiny, tiny island between Manhattan and Queens. And I live on the 16th floor. And from my window, I have the view of East River and then the east side of Manhattan on the other side of the river. And very often at night, I look out the window and I really wonder, like, am I really here? I think when I was 10, 11, 12, I couldn't even have imagined this life. So it's really been a journey and feels like there's been kind of spirit guiding me because it's not an intentional process. Like I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. So that's that. So I grew up in New Delhi as a kid. I was born in Calcutta because my parents' family were in Calcutta. And maybe just to frame this, I sometimes jokingly or semi-jokingly call myself a third-generation exile because both sides of my grandparents were born in what is now Bangladesh. And they emigrated to India before the partition or around the time of partition to get away from the communal strife. Then my father moved from where his family settled to New Delhi, which is like Washington, D.C., the capital, because he had a government job. And that's where I grew up. I was born in Calcutta because that's where my parents were, but I grew up in Delhi. And then I studied in the south of India for many years. I did my PhD, master's and PhD, both in South. And then I crossed the pond, literally, the US. So it's interesting that there's been a lot of ground covered in my life. And ground covered both geographically as well as in every other way. So I grew up nominally Hindu, I would say, in the sense that my family was Hindu, but my father was a very avowed atheist. I mean, he did not believe in religion at all. He was a mathematician. And my mother kind of became more spiritual over her lifetime, but when I was young, not so much. And then for myself, as a young person, I got really interested. In fact, my very first spiritual introduction was the book called The Tao of Physics by Fritjof Capra. And so I read that book and it made sense to me. And then I started hanging out with the Advaita Vedanta people. And I had some fun there, but also had some arguments with the nuns and the priests. And eventually, at one point, I was told, don't come back. You ask too many questions and you disrupt the conversations, disrupt the classes. And I'm 16 at that time. So I said, fine, I have nothing to do with religion. It's all like a bunch of crap. So I'm going to go and become a scientist. And I don't want to have anything to do with religion. So I decided to do my PhD and so on and so forth. I finished my PhD. I came to this country as a postdoc. And it was only after I came here that I started to slowly notice a void sort of deep inside me. There was something that was not being addressed. And I didn't quite put my finger on what was missing, but something I knew was missing. And then, interestingly, somebody introduced me to Joseph Campbell's work with the relative mythology, the comparative mythology. And through him, I knew about Carl Jung's work, and I got completely fascinated by that work. And that was kind of, I sometimes jokingly call the backdoor entry to spirituality. So I came through Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung into spirituality. I found some teachers in North American indigenous practices. That's where I started. Over time, I realized that there was a lot of appropriation happening because my teachers, although they were trained in these traditions, they didn't come from these traditions. And so I was looking for a place to kind of deepen my own spirituality. I knew that I could not possibly be in any place that had just one religious flavor, no matter what it was. And that's when I came across One Spirit, and basically I never left. I have had my ups and downs with the organization, but I really do feel there's something fundamentally resonates with my soul about this place, that all spiritual traditions, all religions have a basic common truth. And that's where I want to kind of anchor myself.
Yeah, so that's your experience from a spiritual perspective. And I am curious, given that we are going to talk about the election, about your experience of immigrating, of coming to this country, and your experience of being a first-generation American.
Right. Yeah. So that's a good question. And, again, like I have a lot of half joking things that I say. And one of the things that I say is I am absolutely 100% a New Yorker. I have no doubt in my mind that I'm a New Yorker. I own the sidewalks. American, not so much. Because, I don't know whether I truly feel like an American. But I know that I do live here. I know that I'm married to an American, a Caucasian, a person who's kind of been in this country for many, many generations. I have a biracial child. So I'm definitely invested in the American politics and an American way of life. But at my core, I really don't identify as an American. It's an interesting place for me to sit as I watch this election and everything else around it.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's a question for you. How does it feel for you as someone who technically votes as an American and is affected by the American system to watch what is going on in politics and specifically in this election? How are you experiencing that?
I think the first thing I'll say is that I am in a very different place than I was a couple weeks ago. Once Kamala became a real viable candidate, something fundamentally shifted for me in terms of having hope about this country. Because, I mean, everything said and done, one of the things about America that I truly think is powerful is that it is an experiment. This country is an experiment. It's an experiment of how people with very, very different upbringing, very, very different, even value systems. So I came here end of 1995. So I've been here long enough to see a few iterations of the political system, including the time with Obama when we felt like things were going in the right direction, and then things were not going so much in the right direction. So I do feel hope with Kamala and her running mate, and both for who she is as a human being, and I think who she represents, that she represents the outsider, the person who's not seen, who has not been center of stage traditionally. So I feel a lot of hope with that. And at the same time, I also know that political systems are large and complex and unwieldy. So just because you have somebody who you like and trust as the leader doesn't necessarily mean the problems are solved, because they inherit the mess. It's deep and dark.
Right.
And it's not going to be an easy turnaround, I don't think. But I am way more hopeful.
Right. Yeah, that's great. It's great to hear and to understand that perspective from someone who has a different background than I do, obviously. Right. So it's great to hear about that. And I think there has been such an upswelling with Kamala's announcement in general, but also to understand the implications that there's been this upswelling because it's someone else, but also that upswelling is because of who she is, right? Because she does look different, because it's a woman of color from a different background who, has stepchildren, and she has an experience that's very different than past candidates have had and past presidents have had, obviously. And so that's one of the things that I think is so profound about this movement that's happening, is that people are able to identify with her. And now Tim Walz also is like bringing in the dad energy, which is so wonderful. But people feel like they can actually relate to her, which feels really different. And I'm not saying necessarily that that's what you're experiencing, but I do think it's a really powerful part of this movement and why it potentially is continuing to be a movement, and hopefully will continue to be a movement. And as you said, politics is very complicated and it is a big system. And of course, I think one of the things that's so important is that we recognize that politicians are part of a system, and that, we treat them as people and as humans. And I think that's one thing that she's showing, is like, I am a human with faults and I am willing to accept that, right? But this election feels bigger. Like it feels bigger because I think there's such a threat right now for so many people with what's going on and what could potentially happen with Project 2025. And if Trump was to be in office, there's a lot of fear around that. And so it's big in that sense. But it's also big in my mind because it feels like it's a part of something bigger. It feels like we're at this really important moment in history, in the evolution of our species, in the evolution of Earth, and that the election is just part of that bigger picture, that there's something else going on here. And I'm curious about your perspective on that, because you have studied so many different spiritual traditions and have your hands dabbling in all kinds of things. Yeah, so I'm curious about your perspective around that.
Yeah. And when you talk about dabbling in very many spiritual traditions and philosophies and ways of being, one of the places that I find myself landing more and more is the place of holding paradox, of saying yes and. this is one of those places where I find myself saying yes and. Because on one hand, I agree with you 100% that this is a very special election year. A lot of very important things are at stake. And this is neither the first time that humanity has been at a brink like this, nor is it going to be the last. I mean, if we read any historic, if we read James Baldwin and like close our minds to when he wrote it, it would sound like he wrote it for this time. If we read Mary Oliver, sounds like she's speaking about this time. If we read Maya Angelou, if we read, like the parable of the sower. And then if we go back and read the Greek philosophers, and they are also speaking about this moment of crisis. So on one hand, yes, we are in a critical moment. Humanity has been in critical moments before. So I kind of try and hold both of those. I think one of the things that may be different now compared to before is that the world has become smaller, largely because of technology. And the problems that are facing us are more global, in the sense that climate crisis does not affect one country or one continent. It affects everybody. Environmental refugees affect everybody. So in that sense, maybe we are in a different place than our predecessors.
Yeah.
You and I have talked about this in other contexts, that one of the books that's really really taken me for a journey is this book by Vanessa Andreotti called Hospicing Modernity. I really got into that book and dove deeply into it, and I had conversations with her, and I see what she's saying, that modernity as we understand it is dying. And the only thing that we can do is we can try to oppose it and hang on tooth and nail and have a horrible death of modernity, or we could hospice it. We could give it the grace because it has done certain things. It has given us certain things. But as we understand modernity, it's at an end. And I agree with her. But at the same time, I also feel like when I was deeply in the midst of reading that book, I was feeling really hopeless. Since then, my reading and my focus has moved more to actually a lot of these, what these young African-American women are writing. So things like Black liturgies, emergent strategies, these kind of books. And I find them more hopeful. So again, I'm holding that paradox of, yes, what we knew as the system is dying, and there's a certain somberness to that attending that death, hospicing that death. And there is also something emerging, and it is emerging from the margins. It's emerging from the voices of young Black queer women and people who are truly outside of the mainstream. And I am paying a lot of attention to those voices.
Yeah. And my impression, I am not as well read with all of this as you are, but my impression is that a lot of that shift that is being discussed in these circles is around collectivism and taking care of one another. Like, I'm thinking of Prentice Hemphill and the incredible work and thoughts around slowing down, right?
Yes.
And the undoing of white culture and moving more towards collectivism. And for listeners who don't know what I'm talking about in terms of white culture, I just want to reference that quickly, which is that there is a concept that there is a culture that is specifically white culture, which is largely what America has run under. And it is a culture that really reveres individualism, elitism, success in the form of money and wealth, and the written word, and independence. And there's a lot more information about perfectionism and excellentism, being the best at everything, and hierarchy. And so there's a lot of discussion around, right now we're in this sort of pivotal shift and potentially moving towards something other than that, which is the hope. And it's my hope for sure, because I believe that the white culture that we have been living in, and that has definitely informed our political system, is one that breeds disconnection. It breeds disconnection from self, from others, because we're comparing ourselves to others, and it's all about hierarchy. And it's disconnection from the land, because it's all about the land being resource, not something that we're a part of. And definitely disconnection spiritually, because it's about individualism. And so we're more focused on ourselves than we are on something greater than us. So I'm also very hopeful by some of these teachings that are coming from these incredible people. And I will include in the show notes some of the people that you're talking about and places to follow with some of these ideas, which feel really important. And so, Sushmita, do you feel that right now this election is just sort of part of that like tipping point that we're a part of? I mean, obviously you and I have spoken about how right now it feels like everything that's been in the shadows is coming into the light. And that's been a discussion that has been going on probably since 2016, if not before, right? With the first Trump election, like all of a sudden, the stuff that's been hidden is all of a sudden coming to the surface. And now we're seeing it. It's not that it wasn't there before, it's that we're seeing it now. And my perspective from what I've learned, and maybe it's just a hopeful perspective, is that it's showing up both because it needs to like fight against this movement. It's its way of being like one last hurrah. We're going to throw everything we have at this because we do not want things to change. Yes. And obviously not consciously. People are not consciously choosing that and thinking like, oh my gosh, we're going to lose all the control we have. But I mean, that is happening to some degree. But I'm curious about your perspective around that. Does it feel like that's what's going on, that this is a tipping point and that we do have this choice to evolve or to stay where we are and be churned still in this darkness? Is that where you feel like we are right now?
Okay, so it's a good question, and it's a complex question, and I'm going to try and address it in steps. So as I was listening to you, I was thinking about COVID, because that was a time when suddenly everything we knew as normal went away. And for the first time, especially people in the West experienced the world as connected, not as resource, like a source of resource that comes from other countries, whether it's human resource or objects or raw materials. But people in the West were no longer protected from the problem of those people out there. Because before that, we've had the SARS epidemic, we've had the Ebola epidemic, but it's always been problem of those people out there. That was no longer the case. In fact, if I were to kind of take a step back, I was in New York on 9/11. And that was probably the first time. It was horrible. It was horrible, everything that was happening in New York City. And at the same time, there was a part of me that one of the first reactions I had was, okay, so now the Americans understand what it is like to be invaded in their own land. Because the rest of the world often experiences it on a daily basis. So COVID, right? it happened and our way of being changed completely. Then George Floyd happened in that vacuum. And suddenly everybody woke up, right? There was all these DEI statements being produced by every company that you know.
And everybody started learning that hadn't been informed before. They were like, oops, I got to wake up here. Yeah. Which is, I think what you're talking about is all of these moments of waking up.
But the waking up hasn't necessarily stayed as waking up. I think a lot of it has been walked back. Just with the affirmative action policies being changed and so forth. So that's one of the things. But the other thing is, like, I work in large institutional structures, and I find that large institutions said a lot of things that sound really nice, really good sound bites, really good graphics, but there wasn't a lot of true intention and resources behind what was promised. So a lot of that has kind of slowly eroded. Maybe not gone back to what it was before COVID, but definitely not, it's not where it was at the peak of the kind of Black Lives Matter movement.
Right.
So I think
it's like 5 steps forward, 4 steps back.
4 steps back. Exactly. Yeah. And it reminds me of that Rumi poem, like, don't go back to sleep. Winds of the morning have something to tell you, don't go back to sleep. And I feel like in many ways we have gone back to sleep. So, and similarly, I think we went back to sleep when we had 2 cycles of Obama administration. We went back to sleep because, we have a Black president. All's good. We are great. And part of me worries that might happen again, because we as human beings don't like to be held to the fire. It's too uncomfortable.
And it's a really big change that is being called for in terms of people changing their values and their decisions, and there are sacrifices involved. And so it's a tough pull, right? And I think that there are definitely
asked to let go, to release some of the privileges that have been a given.
Right.
Because to call in outside voices, the person who was at the center has to move sideways.
Right. Which reminds me of Joe Biden. Yeah. Indeed. Right. Yeah. Which I do feel so strongly was such a powerful act for him to do that. And I am really glad that he is getting the attention that he deserves for that incredibly selfless act, which I do think is what leadership is. So that's, and I do think what you're saying, it takes, it was totally. Yeah, absolutely. And I do think it's hard for people to take that step back. It is. Yeah, so and it's also something that we're being called to do, I feel.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so while I do feel hopeful, I don't feel Pollyanna-ish. I don't think it's going to be easy. And I think we are going to, because I think we like our comfort. It's all very nice to say, I support the marginalized voice. I support the outsider voice. But if it costs my child going to a particular school or university, or it costs my retirement savings, or it costs something
taxes.
Like that, taxes, am I still going to say those things and mean it and stand behind it and take actions?
Right. Am I going to walk the talk? Which is
exactly
the question, I think, for many people. Yeah. But I mean, I'm hopeful. I'm personally hopeful. And obviously, same. I don't want to be in a Pollyanna perspective by any means, but I am hopeful that Kamala will get elected. And like you said, I think it's so interesting because it's not one and done. It's not she gets elected and our job is done, because it does feel like what you've talked about, that this system needs to be overhauled. Like this is a really big system and there's a lot of moving parts. And so my hope is that we are in a place where there's going to be systemic change in many ways, but we need to be a part of that, right? So can this election be one piece of a movement as opposed to the end of a movement, right? Can it be the beginning instead of the end? Actually, that makes me think of this wonderful quote from David Wallace. David Wallace was one of the teachers at One Spirit. He's a spiritual leader. I am hoping that he is going to be on this podcast with me. He is a dear friend of Sushmita's and he's a wonderful speaker. And he did a commencement at One Spirit. And I want to be clear that commencement, contrary to what you think it is actually the graduation at One Spirit. And so when we complete our 2 years of seminary, we have our ordination, which is separate. It's a more private and intimate ceremony. And then we have this wonderful interfaith graduation, if you will. But the graduation he actually calls commencement. And they have called it commencement forever because he speaks at one of the commencements that I've seen recorded about the fact that this is the beginning, of your journey as a ministry, and this is just the beginning. And so it's a commencement. It is a beginning of ministry as opposed to an end of seminary. And it feels like we could look at the election that way, right? Like, let's hope that Kamala does get elected. And when she does, that it is the beginning and not the end. And it is not a graduation, but a commencement. Feels really powerful.
Completely agree with that. And as you were talking, one of the thoughts that was going through my mind is maybe one way for people like us is to, I don't know how to put this properly, but I'll try. So we talk about the white supremacist culture, as you were talking about earlier, of I am the center of the universe and I have power and perfectionism and hierarchy and all of that. But maybe what we don't talk about enough is how that makes people within who have bought into that value system extremely lonely, extremely disconnected, extremely heartbroken.
Yeah.
And maybe the connected way that we all feel is the way forward, that web of interconnection is maybe you will have less in your 401k, but you will feel more cared for and more part of something larger, part of something that has hope and solidarity and community, because I think as human beings, that's what we are looking for.
Agreed.
We haven't found that, so we look at the 401k.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%, because we think that that's what we need. And it's the thing that we think we need because we don't have the things that we actually need, right? Like if we had the community connection and if we were living in connection, then we wouldn't feel so in need of that, because it's like I have to have that as safety and security because I don't have my safety and security in other ways. And I don't have a plan moving forward. And, you know, you and I will talk, I hope at some point, about like intergenerational living and community living and all the things that we've talked about, which is so important, and how community is necessary and lacking so much from our culture, which I think is so important. And a huge part of the connected way in general is to live actually in connection and to have more community and relationships in our lives, which does not mean revering independence and individualism. It's the opposite. And so I love that perspective. That's really helpful. So pivoting a little bit, one of the things that I'm really curious about for you, because you have studied so many things, you grew up in a somewhat Hindu household. You grew up with an atheist parent also. You grew up in India, then you moved to America. You've studied so many different philosophies and traditions and spiritualities, and you don't like having your hands in one, you like having your hands in a lot. I'm really curious, and I know this is a big question, but I'm curious if you could sort of boil down the really big things that you believe right now, like where your personal spiritual truths lie currently.
And I would say maybe at the very core of my spiritual belief is this idea of holding paradoxes, of saying this is true and that is true too. That light lives within darkness, darkness lives within light, kind of the image of the Tai Chi symbol. And
Taoism.
The whole idea of the Tao, the 1 leads to 2, 2 leads to 3, 3 leads to the 10,000 things. And this idea of, so for me, and this is where I still resonate very strongly with Jung's teachings of where I want to be is more whole rather than be more perfect. I don't want to remove things from me, but I want to bring more of who I am into who I show up as. That includes the so-called good and the so-called not so great. And hold it all, because that's what gives complexity, that's what gives texture, that's what creates light and shadow, that chiaroscuro, which any artist knows, that's where art lives. It doesn't live in pure light. And so I think holding complexity, even duality, in fact, it's interesting because one of the teachers, I've been really influenced by a lot of young teachers lately, and one of them is Sophie Strand. And she recently wrote this blog. It said something that really caught me. It was really beautifully written. And I'm paraphrasing, of course, I don't have the words in front of me. But she said, even this idea of holding duality, like this and its opposite, may be too simple. Because we are in a time now that we are being asked to not hold two, but 1,000, 10,000, 1,000,000 things, possibilities together. And I think there's a real truth there. So being able to hold complexity and knowing that from complexity, and this is where my scientific being comes alive, because I know it's in these complex systems that you can have emergence, you can have something completely new arise. But it can only arise when the system is sufficiently complex.
Right.
Hence, the interactions of the parts become unpredictable. So in that sense, I think we might, so the crux that you were talking about way back in the early part of the conversation, that are we at the verge of something new happening? That's where I feel the hope that because we are living in such a complex time, because there's so much complexity present, that it is possible that emergence could happen, and we can't predict. The thing with emergence is you can't predict ahead of time. Right? So it's one of the probabilities. There's a certain probability of something emerging, but we don't know. We can't predict ahead of time. And that kind of, it's a coherence of random things that can come up with some form or structure or pattern, like the murmurations of the birds, or like that. So
and there is, from what you're talking about, also getting comfortable with the unknown, which I think is actually, I think it's a personal practice for so many of us, but also it's a spiritual practice, because that's what spirituality is accepting that we don't know. But there is something going on and we can't see it. And succumbing to that and being like, I am a part of something that I do not have control over. And it does feel like we're sort of riding this wave in a turbulent ocean right now. And there are so many possibilities, like you're talking about, so many waves and so many different factors at play in that ocean. And we don't know where we're headed, but it is a sense of like, how can we get comfortable with the fact that we're juggling 1,000 things, like you talked about.
Right.
So
uncertainty is uncomfortable. Absolutely. But imagine if your life was completely predictable. How boring would that be?
So boring. And I'm sure that many listeners, sometimes I'm like, I would like to be bored right now. I would love the boring known because this is quite a ride that we're on. But it's also, I feel it's a part of this huge change that we're moving through as a society and as a people. And so it feels profound, even if it's wildly uncomfortable. Yeah. So with all of the things that you have learned and where your beliefs are and looking at duality and non-duality and different spiritual traditions and all of the things that you pay attention to, how do you feel about policy in general? How is that affecting what you care about and what matters to you, which then, of course, affects how you vote, right? So like, what are the things that matter to you in general as a person and a spiritual teacher and a leader and a parent and, you know, so many different things? What matters to you right now? What's important?
So another great question. And if I'm being absolutely honest, if I'm being 100% honest, if the world was different than what it is, I would not vote for any of the two big parties. I would look for an independent person who has really creative, out-of-the-box ideas which matches the complexity of this time. And the pragmatic part of me knows that that is basically voting by not voting on one side or the other. So the pragmatic part of me is going to go and vote as I will vote. But am I doing that with all of myself? The answer is no. I think there's a strong bit of anarchist in me that wants to kind of just break everything apart and just build from scratch. But the pragmatist in me knows that that's a bad idea, especially given the alternatives.
Yeah.
Realistic.
Well, and I do think it's an interesting conversation. You know, is there a way to rebuild, right? And I think a lot of people have had that conversation. Is there a way to undo the system and rebuild it in a different way? And maybe there is.
What might be the way to do it is to start very locally with those really radical changes. Whereas on the large federal level, stay with sort of the least disturbing option.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is definitely the least disturbing option. I think it also, for me, it feels like the option that does have the capacity to affect the most change in a positive direction to move towards connection, because I do feel that Kamala's policies, right, and the Democratic policies, generally speaking, are more about caring for other people. They're more about taking care of the whole versus the individual, right? And so that's important right now, but then they're also open to change and they're open to hearing people's voices. And I saw this great post about how we're voting for an administration, we're not voting for a president, right? And so it's also about the people that are interested in working with this person and they're interested in working with, right? And so I do feel that there's a lot of potential there and much more potential, obviously, because the idea is, even if it means that we are, you know, staying where we've been and then moving forward a little bit, it's much better than sliding way back. Well, I so appreciate you and these insights that you've shared. It's so wonderful to connect with you. I know that there is so much more that we could talk about, and I hope that we will talk about it again in another episode coming up, probably after the election, when we can talk more about all of the spiritual and religious stuff and science and all of the things. So everybody, Sushmita is an amazing, amazing leader. She is faculty at One Spirit. She is a professor. She is a scientist. She is so many things, and you can learn more about her, again, at her website at on-seeing.com. And you can also follow her on Facebook, where she's most active in terms of social media. And I will put all of that in the show notes so that you can find her to follow along and to learn from her continuously. She also has an incredible creative practice that I also love, which is soul collage. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us here with Sushmita, and I will see you on the next episode. Thanks for joining me for this episode. It means so much that you're taking time to join me in this journey of living the connected way. You can find all the resources I referenced in the show notes and on the podcast page at theconnectedway.com. A note about sponsorship. This podcast is currently sponsored by me, Rev Dev, and you, the listeners. If you're interested in supporting the podcast and me doing the work of The Connected Way, you can donate on the podcast webpage or find easy links to donate in my bio on Instagram at revdev_The Connected Way. There is never any pressure, but any support helps me to continue doing this work. Also, I'd love to hear your biggest takeaways from the show today. What inspired you? Surprised you? Made you think? Anything? Let me know by posting a comment or DMing me on Instagram, or you can always send me a message on the website. Thanks again for being here, friends. May this podcast bring more connection to you and to the collective. And so it is. See you next time.